the Gadigal and Wangal peoples of the Eora Nation. We pay respect to elders past, present and future, as well as all the elders on the lands where this broadcast is being watched. This is and will always be Aboriginal land. So we are recording this session today, and we hope that you are familiar with our program. The Green Living Centre program is an initiative of the Inner West Council, and we support our community to live sustainably and adopt and transition to a low carbon lifestyle. And I guess what that really means is that we focus on informing the community about day-to-day activities like energy and water use, and also waste, and particularly around consumption. So what, how and where we buy items like clothing, food, and what actions we can take around energy use, like active transport. So really encouraging walking and cycling, and also public transport. So we do that through, as you can see on the screen there, we have workshops throughout the year, webinars like this one, and hold events. We also are active on Facebook and Instagram, and we have a website and regular e-newsletter. So we will indicate some ways you can engage with us at the end if you'd like to further. So I know you've probably worked out your way around Microsoft Teams by now, but if you haven't already, just a few hints here. The meeting tools are usually located across the top. If not, usually across the bottom, and they're slightly different to other platforms you might be used to using. So there's a few things that you can do. You can check other participants in the meeting, but the main thing to know about is the second icon along, which is the chat, where you'll be able to ask questions of Gavin throughout the presentation, and then we'll get to those right at the end. Also, throughout you can give us a reaction. So if there's something that you like, love, or feel like giving Gavin a clap, then you can do that there. Just a reminder to turn your camera off and to mute yourself, because as we are recording, this will show up in the final recording if you don't. Okay. So we'll move on to the presentation. So how it will work is Gavin will talk us through the topic of Australian native bees. Please ask questions throughout, and I will put them to Gavin if they are relevant. Otherwise, we'll do a more of a Q&A right at the end. So to get us started, I'll introduce Gavin. Gavin Smith is a local Inner Westie. He's a member of the Amateur Beekeepers Association, and is a dedicated educator and a committee member of both the Sydney Bee Club and the Inner West Beekeepers. So he has a wealth of knowledge, and we're really excited to have Gavin with us to share that today. So over to you, Gavin.
Thank you very much, Emma. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Pollinator Week. Native Pollinator Week begins today. It was quite a timely email we got from Emma initially to ask me to do this talk and when should it happen. So today is the first of Pollinator Week. And if you look up the websites for Australian native bees, you'll find plenty of references and ways in which you can get involved in ways you can get involved with native bees and scientific citizen projects, so that you can you'll know what to look for after today, I hope. Anyway, thank you very much. This opening shot I took at Grafton in the spring some years ago, and that tiny little black thing in there is an Australian native bee. Our native bees are a great variety. So I'll get to the next slide, and thanks, Emma. So just to give you a basic rundown, we've got 2,000 species in Australia, we think. We've got about 1,600 named, but there's still a lot of bees out there that we have never seen, or have been seen but never been classified. The European bee, which you're all familiar with, is an import. So we sort of have to look at our native bees because they're even more special than the honeybee. When you're looking for them in your garden, whereabouts are they going to live? Well, there are such a variety that we can break them down into these particular groups. It's a bit diverse, like the Australian population. You've got builders, you've got those that mine, that dig underground or go into banks. We've got squatters that take over the nests of other insects or the holes made by other insects. We've got those that will actually drill into to timber and to reeds. And you've got thieves. They're the parasitic bees that, or cuckoo bees that take over and lay their eggs in other bees' nests. So in Australia, on the world, there are probably 80,000 varieties of bees, or maybe, and some of them are very large. I'll get to the largest bees in Australia soon, and we also happen in Australia to have the smallest bee. It's just under a millimetre in size. So what you're looking at on the 3 slides there, the first one, would you believe it? I thought it was a native bee initially, and it turns out it comes from Africa. It's a Carter bee, and it's come into Australia like the quite by accident. Although the honeybee didn't come in by accident, that was definitely a planned thing. The middle one is a very common one in your garden. It's the blue-banded bee, and the little one on the right-hand side is the neon or robber bee, which is a parasitic bee. Okay, next slide, please. These guys came to Australia in about 1820, and they're a feral animal. So they were brought in so that we could have honey, and that's about it. But they're very good pollinators as well. Trouble is, they compete with our other native bees and our other native animals in that they, when they swarm, if they're not looked after by beekeepers, they will swarm. They'll take over all the hollows that are so important to our Australian native birds, all our parrots, and our native animals like all the possums. The native bees get a hard time too, because these guys will come out at 12 degrees when it's a really low temperatures and start foraging, whereas most of our native bees don't come out until it's about 18 degrees. So they get the jump on our natives, and they're causing some problems with our native bees. Next slide, please. The main problem with main reason we love our bees is they are producing so much of our food. All our crops need pollinators, and we've discovered that a lot of our native bees pollinate extremely very efficiently compared to the honeybee. The honeybee, of course, has diseases, and so we're the last continent in the world that has no varroa destructor. It's a little mite that lives on the honeybee. It jumped species some years ago, and it's decimated the bee populations all over Europe and America. So we've got to be extremely careful if we're going to do honeybees, that we check and recheck for disease and the particular mite. So if you want to be keeping bees, please keep our natives, and encourage our governments to upgrade all their biosecurity plans so that we keep this little nasty thing out of this country. Next slide, Emma, please. Thank you. A lot of people look at their gardens and they will take photographs and they'll put it in and they'll say, is this a bee or a fly? Or is it a wasp? Difficult to tell sometimes because we have mimics in the insect world. So we have flies that imitate wasps. We have wasps that imitate flies. And we also have bees that imitate wasps. Bees exactly are quite different in that they all have 4 wings, whereas flies have 2, and they're dependent on pollen and nectar to feed their young. And the majority of Australian native bees are solitary. We've only got 11 varieties that actually form a hive and will make honey. And one of the things that people probably don't know is that wasps developed first in the insect world, and they evolved into bees. So there's a very strong parallel between a wasp and a bee. They have 4 wings, they have 6 legs, they have 3 body parts, and they all depend on protein and carbohydrates for their food. So wasps are mostly meat eaters. A very high protein diet. And what happened over time, of course, flowers developed and they needed pollinators, and they produced more and more pollen in order to reproduce. And it was the pollen, which is the high protein part of their diet. So the wasps modified their eating habits. Instead of eating their delicious grubs and spiders and other insects, they started to eat this pollen and found it quite satisfactory and even tastier than your usual maggot or caterpillar. And so they evolved this technique of taking pollen and storing it. So you'll find a parallel universe between the two. We have a couple of bees in the world that are still carnivorous, but they're not in Australia, thank goodness. Okay, next slide, please. Many of our community gardens and our schools are now populating gardens with this little tiny bee called Tetragonium carbonaria. The reason being it has no sting, and it's been utilised by our Aboriginal people for thousands of years because it's a very special little bee. We call it the sugar bag bee because it actually has nectar stored in little pots, and it lives all the way along the coast from far north Queensland all the way down to Bega in the south coast. It's very temperature sensitive. Again, it won't come out until it's 18 degrees, and it has a very limited flying range for the collection of the pollen. So it's about 500 meters, whereas the honeybee goes 5 kilometers. So this foraging range is quite small. We have slowly been expanding this bee in Sydney, and thanks to Peter Clark from Ku-ring-gai Council, he started the project maybe 20 years ago now, and he has since retired, but he was the man that introduced me to this little bee. They produce honey in very small quantities, but it can be harvested and lasts. What, 2 years ago, I suppose, we started our first competition for their honey at the Royal Easter Show, and we had over 100 people submitting their entries, little jars of their honey. So the competition has begun. Now these guys, of their varieties, are only 11 out of 2,000, so they're very precious. Next, please. They carry huge quantities of pollen, as you can see in this little guy. They have pollen pants on the back legs, similar to a honeybee. And if anybody's had the pleasure of sitting in front of one of their hives, you can see these guys with their little popper pants coming into the hive. They also bring in resin from trees. Now, most bees produce propolis. Now, propolis is actually resin from plants. They chew the edges of the top leaves of trees. The trees say, oh, something's eating me. I'm going to produce a resin to drive them off. And so the bees collect that resin, again, as if it's like the pollen. And you have these little jewels of resin come in, and they build their entire structure inside the hive with a mixture of resin and wax, which they produce in their abdomen. So this is very precious, and it's been utilized as medicine by the Aboriginal people for thousands of years. The law of the Aboriginal people along the coast was that only the women could collect the honey and the sugar bag. The reason being that when the men would go out on a hunt, they would actually seek out this bee for sustenance, because they would not just take the honey, they would eat the entire nest. It's about the size of a softball, and all the babies within that nest are all protein, and so you get this huge, shall we say, sugar hit and a protein hit by eating the entire hive. So this is why the women said no, anything near their particular territory was women's business, because the men would get greedy and eat a lot. Next one, please. We actually have made hives which they take to quite easily. And this is called an oath hive. It stands for Original Australian Tetragonula Hive. And this was developed by a man called Tim Hurd. Tim Hurd has done all the research on this particular bee. And when you split it at springtime, you can make 2 hives, because it has this wonderful spiral advancing front. And that means that we can split it exactly in 2 and we make 2 hives. They do not swarm like the honeybee. This is the easiest and the quickest way in which to reproduce their hives. We drain off the honey that you can see glistening in that particular photo, and you can see the orange and yellow pollen, all kept in these very neat little 5 to 10 millimeter sacks made of wax and resin. So we drain it off and we put a new top and a new bottom, and we've got 2 hives. You actually have to have somebody who's got a hive so that you can reproduce this way. They don't swarm. However, they do fly out of the hive once a very sunny day in their thousands, and they produce a cloud of bees. I call that a joy flight. And as the temperature drops, they will go back to hive. The other time that they will come out in large numbers is in mating flights. And usually there is 1 queen produced, and she will go back into the hive and start reproducing. And they have reserve queens or princesses in the hive. This research has only just recently been done by Francisco, a Mexican PhD student who's been working with the university, and he's been doing a lot of work on the reproduction of these bees, and especially the queens. He's found that these reserve queens hide away from the other bees, who will attack them if they get mistaken or discovered, and they may be seen as a foreign queen. Not quite sure why, but they hide in the remote areas of the hive, and only come out once they're aware that a queen has died. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. Sorry. These are the little bags. Oh, sorry. There we go. Right. So that's a close-up of the spiraling, beautiful structure of the brood. The brood consists of all these little pots. The bees stock them with a mixture of honey and pollen in little form of cakes. The queen comes along, lays an egg on top, and then the bees cover that, completely enclose the egg, and that baby bee, once it's hatched from the egg, goes through all the stages that you normally get for an insect. So the egg is laid, it will become a larvae, then it'll become a pupa, and then it will chew its way out and become a fully fledged adult bee. Whereas the honeybee itself, they have to hand feed their babies. They're very susceptible to all sorts of things in that process for the first week or so of their life. Whereas these guys, they're totally self-contained, and they emerge a long time after a honeybee. These take about 50 days to mature, whereas the honeybee takes 21 days. So the reproduction rate of the honeybee is much faster. Again, an advantage they have over these bees. Now, if you look carefully on the screen to the top left-hand corner of the picture, you'll see some large cells separate from the others. And they're queen cells, and they, as I say, they will produce these reserve queens. There's still a lot more research to be done, but the reason we wanted so many of these little bees is that they're such good pollinators for our crops that have very small flowers, like lychees, mangoes, macadamia nuts, etc. Next slide, please. These are little honey pots. I found this inside a telephone exchange box under the ground. That was a very comfortable place for them to develop, and I transferred it into a hive because the people working for the telephones, they usually just scoop it out, throw it away, not realizing what a valuable little asset these bees are. So these are the honey pots, the sugar bags, and they store both pollen and honey packed into these little balls. Thanks, Emma. Now we come to our natives. We've got 7 families of bees in the world, and we have 5 in Australia, and one of those is exclusively Australian. And bees are classified by the length of their tongues. 2 of the 5 species that we have in Australia are regarded as long-tongued bees, and the others are short-tongued bees. Flowers develop on plants, so they have these long. This is a honeysuckle with a blue-banded bee. You can see the tongue is extremely long, and when this bee flies, it can't completely retract its tongue, so it actually flies with it dangling down or tucked under its body. The short-tongued bees actually lap from open flowers. So you have these 2 distinct tongue types, and they're adapted to different types of flowers. Now, these guys are classified as miners. They actually will be making their homes in your house if you happen to have one of the older brick homes with soft mortar between the bricks. Or if you're a very modern house and you're built out of mud brick, they love mud bricks. They will dig a hole quite happily, quite deeply into your brickwork, and they lay the eggs in series. They close each section off so that every new egg laid on a little cake of pollen and nectar bound together. They'll emerge over a period of time, and they'll close it off with what looks like mud. So it's a mixture of saliva and soil. And these are particularly good because they do a particular way of pollinating. They're called buzz pollinators. The only other buzz pollinators in Europe are the bumblebee. So what happens to this bee? It'll fly in front of the flower, and it will vibrate its wings and its body, and at a certain frequency, the flower picks up that vibration and will throw its pollen at the bee. Now, one of the most important plants that we have that does this is the tomato plant. So all the tomato growers would love to have this bee in large numbers, but unfortunately it doesn't like hothouses. So the job of this particular bee is now done by people using vibrators. And their job is to go up and down the vines in these hothouses, vibrating in front of the flowers to get the pollen. So next time you're at the supermarket and you're buying those beautiful, shall we say, synthetic tomatoes, all the same size, same shape, some poor person has had to vibrate all of those using a hand vibrator millions of times up and down the rows. It's probably the worst job you could get in the agricultural business. Next slide, please. It's quite a common one in your garden. If you look closely, you'll see they have a very rapid flying technique, and they zoom about very, very quickly. They're very hard to photograph because they are only in front of the flower a very short time, but it's a beautiful bee, and it has that beautiful furry thorax, which was able to carry a huge quantity of pollen. So it's a very good pollinator. Next, please. There you have probably the ultimate photograph of the blue-banded bee. I absolutely love this photograph. You can see the tongue. It's very, very long. It's just in front of the front leg. You can look at the fur. Now, all the patterns on bees that you see are caused by the refraction of light reflected through the fur. And you've got this gorgeous opal eye. And just there, you've got these huge mandibles. The mandibles are to help the bee to burrow and also to go to sleep at night. They find a twig, a very small piece of grass, and they lock their jaws on that twig and they go to sleep. And you might find a congregation of these bees looking like a bunch of grapes hanging off a twig. It's quite beautiful. And I didn't do this at the beginning, but I should have warned you that this whole talk can cause a really serious virus. It's called the virus by my friend. You get fascinated with these creatures. It takes over your brain and your life, and you spend hours looking at what people have photographed with the native bees. And this one is a beauty. And if you can, later, have a look at a thing called, it's a clip by one of our bee nuts, as I call them. It's called Blue-Banded Bees Kung Fu Fighting, where they have set the whole thing to music, and it's just wonderful. Next slide, please. This is one of the biggest bees in Australia, a sleeping teddy bear bee, similar family to the blue-banded bee. Again, it's a miner. It digs a very deep underground nest, and it goes down many meters and has galleries where the female bees lay their eggs. And again, this one is a very big bee. You'll hear it coming. It's very beautiful. And this one is actually asleep. They don't have any eyelids, so it looks very odd. I think this is actually sleeping. Next, please. This is a really important bee in Western Australia. It's a miner, and it chooses very sandy desert soil to create its burrows. Now, these are solitary, but in this particular case, they lay in the same area. So you might have thousands of these bees laying in the same area in Western Australia. Why is it so important? Well, the females all lay their eggs underground and they all emerge approximately the same day. So for the Aboriginal people, this was the time of spring, and it was a very clear marking of the passage of time and the time when the people knew when they could go for certain foods that they needed to hunt or foods that they needed to grow or gather. So it's a remarkable bee. And again, if you look on the native bee websites, you'll find a wonderful movie of this whole area where this bee is emerging. Next one, please. This one is called the blue neon bee. It actually flashes as it flies. It's just the most incredible bee. And the reason that it flashes so is that the hairs that make up its protective surface, it's sort of virtually armor plated. And most bees don't like this animal. So it's developed this incredible network of plates made out of hair. And as the sun reflects as it flies, it flashes in the light. A remarkable looking bee, but it's a cuckoo bee. And the blue banded bee is its favorite nest, and also the teddy bear bee. There are a couple of these bees which are exquisite. Next slide, please. Get some idea of how beautiful. Again, it's asleep. But yeah, so it's armor plating. It's quite visible there. And it's all made from thick fur. Fabulous animal. Next, please. This is the biggest bee in Australia, and it's out at the moment. If you go bushwalking at all, and especially up around the Hawkesbury, you'll see this bee. You'll hear it first because it's about over nearly 25 millimeters long, and it's known as the Great Carpenter Bee because this is a driller. She will find particular grass trees, xanthorrheas, with the long stalks. There are lots of thousands of little flowers on top. And she will drill a hole through the stalk and then hollow out the inside of the flower stalk. And you might find several females in the same flower stalk. So you look for the characteristic hole that they drill. It's around about 10 millimeters in diameter. And they protect their hive by sticking their backsides out when they're still working, and they'll seal off the hole in that way whilst they're protecting their eggs. Now they will make a very long hollow, over 300 millimeters in length, and lay their eggs in there, and they'll close off each section with chewed up particles of timber mixed with saliva, and it's a fabulously beautiful bee. We have two color varieties. There's a blue and there's the green, and they're iridescent, just absolutely delightful. Next slide, please. A beautiful little bee that you will find if you are a rose grower. I have a friend at Balmain who said to me one day, he said, "Oh, some bloody thing's getting into my roses. It's chewing holes in my leaves. I don't know what the spray will kill it." I said, "Don't kill it. Don't kill it." I said, "That's a native bee. It's called the leaf cutter. And she will take that leaf, a perfect circle, she'll chew it off with her mandibles, hold it as you can see it there with her legs, fly it to the nest, which is usually just another insect's hole, or it might be a piece of bamboo that you've put in your bee hotel, and she'll fly that in and line the inside of a nest with the leaf, then stock that with pollen and honey mix, lay an egg on top, and then close it off with another leaf door. And so repeat the process until she's filled up that entire length of hollow. The leafcutter bee is very common in Sydney, and check your roses and anything which has got a soft leaf, and look very carefully. If you see circles cut in the leaves, you know what's causing it. It's the leafcutter bee, and she's a beautiful little pollinator. Now this one doesn't carry pollen on its legs like the honeybee or the tetragonula. It carries it on that lovely yellow furry bit under the abdomen. It's a very efficient pollinator as a result. So it's virtually a flying pollen brush. It grows to about a centimetre long, very fast flying, but it's very characteristic when you see your leaves with circles cut in them. See if you can see it in flight. Fabulous. Next one, please. This is another one of those parasitic bees. Now this one will parasitize and lay its eggs inside the nest of the leafcutter bee. If you notice that she's a beautiful patterned zebra, she's got a very narrow pointed abdomen. So we can slide that in between the leaves that the leafcutter has lined her hive with, and they will squeeze an egg inside there and move along and squeeze another one somewhere else, and as a result of which the poor leafcutter bee's progeny have less food, because this guy is specially adapted to get her eggs in there, which will hatch quicker, and so feed feed on the pollen and the nectar that the other guys have left for their babies. So we call them cuckoo bees, and this one is a very small, very sneaky little devil. Next, please. These are resin bees. The resin bees live in trees inside hollows that have been left by boring beetles. The larvae of various beetles bore very long holes inside trees, and these guys take them over. And they collect resin to line the inside of their hive. And the resins made by the trees are high in medicinal qualities. So these guys are well and truly taken care of by the resin. So their babies are not only protected from other predators, but they're also protected with the natural antibiotics and the antifungal qualities of the resin these guys collect. So they're actually squatters. They live inside other people's hollows. Next, please. This one is called the Wasp Bee. You can see it has all the characteristics of a wasp, and the early God, I can't remember the name. Oh dear. The people that study insects, what are they called? I've forgotten. Anyway, I'm going to say ornithologists. You know what I mean. Anyway, they got this confused. They said it was a wasp, and then they realized that it wasn't a wasp at all. It was a bee. But you've still got these wasp-like characteristics. This one, of course, is very common, and you'll get this one in any bee hotel that you put up. And they actually make a beautiful door for their hollow. It's made out of chewed up wood, so it's virtually cellulose, and the fibers all meet in the center. So all this bee does is it pushes its head through, and the door automatically closes behind it. And it is a barrier that other insects don't like to go through for some reason. So they have this wonderful design. It's a bit like a camera lens that opens and closes automatically like a shutter. So that's the Wasp Bee. And as you can see, that one is a native plant whose name escapes me at the moment. Next one, please. Very specialist bee. This one is, it will actually have its own territory on a bottle brush. This is a male, and it will protect that particular bottle brush, and it will give off pheromones to tell the girls to come. Here is a good place for you to get your nectar and pollen, and at the same time get your progeny from a very powerful, strong male. Because of his yellow mask, he uses, or they use, both male and female, use the front of their head as a battering ram to get down inside the very fine hair-like structures on bottle brushes, which are really quite strong. And I don't know whether you've ever had a drink from one of these flowers, but it was quite common in the morning to go out and you suck the whole length of the flower, and this is bush food. You would take off the pollen and the nectar that was being produced by that plant, and you'd have a nice sweet drink. So these guys would, like any others, they love these particular plants. So the yellow masked bee is the one we're looking at. Next time, please. Now, most of our flowers are, this particular one, of course, is well known as Leptospermum. We've done a terrific amount of experimentation and study on the honey produced from Leptospermum. Probably you know all about Manuka honey. And it's only because of the medicinal qualities from the nectar that Manuka honey has been now produced worldwide, and especially started in New Zealand. It was initially, the honey from these plants were fed to cattle because it's too thick. The flavor is overpowering, and it sets very quickly into a jelly-like substance. And people couldn't market their honey, so they used to give it to the cattle. And somebody observed the fact that the cattle of particular properties where they were being fed this honey, they didn't need to give them any antibiotics or any other medicines. So the chemists, and I've met the lady that did a lot of the research, she's quite elderly now, and she did that experiment and discovered that it was completely antibiotic and got rid of some of the super bugs that are now in hospitals. And that is now commonly used for dressing wounds and so on, which are susceptible to penicillin and so on. The super bugs don't have any effect on them, but the honey does, and so does the propolis. So this little black bee that you're looking at now, if you're very lucky, you will see it. It flies extremely fast. There's a lot of them out at the moment. They're living under the ground, so they're a minor, and they fly in large numbers and very, very rapid, and they never seem to land on anything. What I do is I get a mesh curtain and I throw it over the whole thing so that when it pops down, I might get one or two specimens to have a look at. But these guys live under the ground and they're very, very small. Next one, please. Another little resin bee, again, very small, very brightly distinguished by its colored thorax. Don't ask me all their names. I have got books and books and books And the CSIRO has produced a fabulous book with all their photos and so on, that you can look their names up. They don't have common names. They have very long names that sometimes I can't even pronounce it. So I won't even attempt at this stage. Next slide, please. You can see the fur on the body, and the pollen is changing color according to the plants. This one is very bright white. The colors of pollens change over time, depending on where the plant is and what the plant variety is. So you can go from white to black and browns and oranges, reds, you name it. It's a huge variety of plants and colors. Next, please. Thank you for listening.
So some really great questions coming through. Thank you so much for presenting all the different types of bees that we're likely to see, the common ones around our garden, and also, you know, what to look for to identify them, particularly the different categories you talked about. That was really, really interesting. But there are quite a few questions. People are asking, like, the types of things we need to do to actually attract you know, these bees to our gardens and our community gardens. What should we be doing?
All right. I usually say it's as simple as ABC. Acacias, any bee for Boronia, borage, callistemons. There's a whole range of plants that you can put in your nurseries and in your gardens that will bring in the bees. Some people say anything which is blue or in the blue spectrum, so purples, mauves, and so on, will attract a lot of bees. But any flower, really, any flower that you want to plant will attract bees. And the native bees are not discriminating between plants at all, except for some very, very special individuals. The bottle brushes, for example, the yellow Wasp Bee, that's a specialty bee relationship to one particular plant. But all the others, they just will roam far and wide just to get pollen and nectar from any plant whatsoever. So lots and lots of flowers. I went to a beautiful garden the other day. Kate is down at Earlwood, and she's got so many varieties of plants. She's got cornflowers, she's got poppies, she's got everything down there. Borage is a wonderful plant that bees come in for. Lavenders, all the lavenders. And yeah, just plant it and they'll come. They're not particularly fussy, just so long as you've got lots and lots of flowers, they'll be there.
Yeah.
And the other thing people often forget is that they say to me, "Oh, I haven't seen a bee in my garden, or there's nothing flowering in my area." I said, "For goodness sake, just look up. Don't look down on the ground. Look up. Look into the trees, and you'll see a lot of the trees at the moment are just absolutely chock-a-block full of flowers. And that's where you look for your native bees. We've got one in particular near our apiary over at Earlwood, not Earlwood, Croydon Park. It looks like it's covered in snow. When you get over there, it may have 4 or 5 different varieties of bees all feeding off that particular blossom. That's one of the varieties, paperbark. It's just covered in flower at the moment.
Excellent. So yeah, the more flowers, the better, I think, is your key message.
Absolutely,
Gavin, across.
And you'll get a list of plants if you go to the aussiebee.com website. There are all the names of the plants that are recommended to be put in there to attract your bees.
And I know you mentioned about, you know, when you talked about the leaf cutter and you said, you know, no sprays. Is that like a general rule?
Oh, that's absolutely.
Avoid pesticides.
If you can be spray free, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, yeah. And what about sort of other types of habitat you might want to be trying to encourage? Like, are there other things apart from the flowers? I know you mentioned
Well,
lists of plants, but like, what sort of habit, I guess,
yeah.
should we be doing in our garden?
Well, I'll
Sort
give you an
of
example. I have a bee buddy. My bee buddy Alison lives at North Turramurra, and she has the most exquisite garden you can imagine. And we build bee hotels. We run workshops in bee hotels, anything to increase the population. She's also got a huge number of tetragonula hives, oath hives, in her garden. But we were working under an umbrella, making these hotels, and there was a patch on the ground that had some mesh over the top, and I stepped onto the mesh, and I got this sudden scream, "Get off my bees!" And she had discovered this tiny black bee that is emerging at the moment. She had found them emerging from this one patch of ground in her lawn. So she had marked it out very specifically, and wherever possible, if you've got an area of your garden where you can leave it undisturbed, you might have some of the minor bees coming in and using that ground for their habitat. I also discovered a patch under a fence at Petersham Park. I discovered there was a whole congregation of the teddy bear bee. And I observed this particular area, and the neighbours next to this fence had let all this leaf litter develop into this a mound, if you like, and there the bees had made their nest, and they were coming in between the palings in the fence. And then I actually saw a neon bee as well emerge. So you really got to keep your eyes open. If you leave an area that's undisturbed, then you'll get somebody coming in to make a habitat there. The other one, you can actually make habitats for blue-banded bees using builder's loam or builder's sand, which has got a bit of clay in the sand. You can fill a box of sand, stand it on its side. There are all sorts of ways of making habitats. If you look at the aussiebee.com website, or you go to there's a Western Australian, Kit Prendergast. She's just got her PhD in bees, native bees, and she's got all sorts of designs for bee hotels and for ways of increasing the population of the blue-banded bee and the other burrowers. Any other questions?
Yes, so there were quite a few other questions, but we're right on, or we are actually just a little bit over 11, so we might have to wrap up.
Right.
But we will send out a follow-up email with lots of the points you've included, including the name of the CSIRO book that you mentioned.
Yeah.
But there are your contact details, Gavin, if anyone wants to follow up. We will also be sharing the presentation as well. There's also lots of community resources on the Inner West Council website, and there'll be the link in the chat for you if you want to follow up, just giving you lots of information on how you can build biodiversity in your local area, whether it's in your backyard or your community garden. So lots of resources on there. And then just to finish up, we've got a survey which we would love you to complete just to give us some feedback on today's session. And also the upcoming workshops we have for December, they're very festive and craft orientated. We've got a crocheting workshop on the 7th of December in the evening in Annandale, and a recycled paper making and gift wrapping workshop on Tuesday the 14th of December, and that'll be at Marrickville Library. So as always, it is priority for Inner West Council residents, but you can book there in Eventbrite. And also, if you want to continue to engage with the Green Living Centre, there's all our details on the last slide there. So please get your phone out, do our survey for us, and give a very big thank you and congratulations and, clap of hands for Gavin, our presenter today, who it's always wonderful to hear his knowledge and learn something from him. So thanks everyone for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at maybe one of our face-to-face workshops, because we're off doing those again, as I said, in December. So see you all again soon.
Thank you very much.